material. What I would suggest now is reading. I'm giving you my slides, but I can also give you references that I'm working from, particularly on Marx. So I'll give you my thesis on Marx, which would make this much more understandable. It's only 100 pages. It's not like reading the whole of Das Kapital, which is thousands of pages. Hang on, what's going on there? Get rid of that. Okay. But what you get out of Marx's dialectics is an alternative theory of value to the neoclassical theory, and one that I think lets us have a theory of profit and a theory of prices and a theory of crises as well, all in one, without the labour theory of value. It actually contradicts the labour theory of value. So the labour theory of value is a huge intellectual mistake by Marx and maintained by modern Marxists, unfortunately. But it's also compatible with the complex systems view of the economy, and I'd argue it even can cope with a thermodynamical view of production too. And what you get at is not just a single price level, multiple price levels, not just the two that was in Keynes, as I've shown you, but 3 or 4 different price levels. And dynamics between those price levels and the distribution of income as well. So the labour theory of value is gone. I won't talk about it in this lecture because you don't have time for it. But what it effectively concludes is that all inputs to production can be a source of surplus. Okay? Not that just labour is, which is the labour theory of value, but all inputs. In fact, I'd argue energy is the key input that we don't include, that was an essential part of where profit comes from. It also provides the basis for a cyclical theory of growth you can find in Marx in chapter 25. I was going to talk about that this morning, but I didn't get time because of the time of demonstrating Minsky software, but I'll show that in tomorrow's lecture. So there's a cyclical theory of growth in Marx, of all things, which most Marxists miss. But the key element I want to talk about today is how this dialectical analysis gives you an endogenous money view of finance. And starting from this idea of the commodity as essential unity in capitalism, and capitalism focusing upon the exchange value of a commodity and putting the use value into the background, that then says exchange value sets price. Use value is irrelevant in setting price at the very first level of thinking about how prices are set. And that formalises the explanation that the classical school uses to say that the long-run cost of production was the explanation for the price at which a goods exchange. But because use value is also essential, it goes beyond just what Ricardo said. So there's a tension between this use value and this exchange value. And I'm going to take you through an extremely long quote from Marx now. It's quite complicated, and it's shown as a footnote in the book called the Grundrisse. And the Grundrisse is German for rough draft. So the Grundrisse was the notes that Marx was writing as he was reading all the classical authors himself again in 1857, because he thought the crisis was coming very, very soon. That was the intellectual basis on which he wrote and published Das Kapital, which was published 10 years later in 1867. So it's like, in effect, like the notes you would take at a library. And in these notes, as well as taking down arguments from the classical authors, he also developed his own ideas. And I think this was the most essential point in developing his logic. And what it would have been was he would have been taking notes on Ricardo or Smith at the time. He'd just read Hegel again by sheer accident. The story was, I think it was a Marxist called Otto Breyer, had turned up at Marx's house in London, and he had a copy of Marx's copy of Hegel's On the Philosophy of Right. So Marx suddenly had a copy of a book of Hegel. He hadn't looked at Hegel since he finished doing his PhD about 20 years earlier, or 15 years earlier. So he just read Hegel for the interest in it, and suddenly Hegelian language turns up in his thinking, which is this dialectics I've mentioned to you before. So here he starts talking about looking at the commodities. He says, is not value to be conceived as a unity of use value and exchange value? Does this have significance in economics? He's posing the question for himself as he sees the idea. He says use value is necessary even in simple exchange or barter, he said. But here exchange value is just because you want to exchange the use values of the two commodities. It has no economic function. So exchange value, when you imagine simple barter taking place, you come from a tribe that makes earthenware pots, somebody else comes from a tribe that makes leather, and you exchange the two. You're exchanging use values. Okay? So exchange value is unimportant at that stage. But he said, it's not a social relation at this stage. Exchange value is not an essential part of the relationship between those tribes. He says, but does this not develop into a system of needs and production? He's asking questions to himself, thinking this idea through. Does not use value as such enter as a determinant form, example, in the relation between capital and labour? He said, if only exchange value matters, and if you read Smith and you read Ricardo, they say use value is essential for exchange, but they then ignore use value. Now, Marx accepted that for the first 13 years that he was working in economics. But now he's saying you can't reject use value. It also has a role. So he's saying if only exchange value plays a role, then how can elements that later relate purely to use value actually turn up? He says price is a formal aspect of this. And it's not in the slightest bit contradicted that exchange value is the predominant bit. So here he's saying exchange value in the foreground, use value in the background. But somehow he must incorporate use value into his thinking. He says, in any case, this is to be examined with exactitude in the examination of value, and not as Ricardo to entirely abstracted from. So Ricardo ignores use value. He said, nor like the dull say, Jean-Baptiste say, who puffs himself up with any presupposition of the word utility. So he said, Ricardo focuses on exchange value and ignores use value. Say makes use value the focus of everything and ignores exchange value. He's saying you've got to bring the two together. So this is a huge pivotal point in Marx's thinking. That's the footnote from the Penguin edition of the book. But you can see this big shift in Marx's thinking at that point. And then from that point on, when you see him thinking about how he understands the economy, it's this dialectic between use value and exchange value that turns up all the way through. And then here he's talking about, towards, again, the same stage, in the relation of capital and labour, exchange value and use value are brought into the relation. One side stands opposite the other as exchange value, the other stands opposite as use value. And this, what he's got as opposites are use value and exchange value. But what they are is foreground and background elements in this unity. So I think let's hope this is the graph where I show, I'm jumping over a lot of work there about how he analyses where surplus comes from and how the wage is set and so on. But what I want to focus on now is how does he apply this use value and exchange value thinking to money? Now, most Marxists believe Marx has a commodity theory of money. They're as bad as the Austrians on that front. You talk to conventional Marxists, they'll say Marx believed money is a commodity. The value of money reflects the value of labour power, or gold is a money commodity, etc., etc. But that's only in the first volume of Capital, and only a very small part of it as well. What Marx says, he's done that to simplify the analysis. All these fixed suppositions become fluid in the further course of development, as he puts it. But later on, he has a credit theory of money. And he says, what does the industrial capitalist pay for loaned capital? And he says, what the buyer of an ordinary commodity buys is its use value. What he pays is its value. He means exchange value when he leaves off the other word. So ordinary buyer buys its use value and pays its exchange value. He says, what the borrower of money buys is likewise its use value. But what does he pay for it? Surely not its price for exchange value, as in the case of ordinary commodities. Because again, if you imagine what is the exchange value of money, thinking in endogenous money terms, it's what's the cost of producing a loan. Now, if you have a bank clerk writing a number into a bank balance, making a loan of $1 million to you, then the cost of producing that $1 million is the cost of the bank clerk's time in writing $1 million in the loan column and $1 million in the deposit column, which is trivial. Okay? So the cost of actually producing that money is trivial, and Marx is aware of this. So he's talking in terms of endogenous creation of money. He's saying, surely you can't be paying the cost of producing the loan, because the cost of producing the loan is trivial. So he said, what actually the borrower pays is not the exchange value for the commodity, but for money it pays the use value. And he says its use value lies in producing profit. So the price you're willing to pay to get lent money to you is the price you're willing to pay for the expectation of the profit you'll think you'll make out of that borrowed money. So he said the value of money does not depend upon the value of commodities, but the quantity of surplus they produce for the owner. So the price you're willing to pay for borrowed money reflects your expectations of profit from that. So using this dialectic, he says the exchange value of money is set by its use value. You get an inversion with money compared to ordinary commodities. So money, the dialectic of money is that it's a commodity in one sense because you have to have it for trade, but it's a non-commodity because you can't produce it using other goods. So it's essential for exchange, but it can't be produced by means of other commodities. So it's both a commodity and a non-commodity. And here's Marx's language, I forgot my inverted commas there. Must always be borne in mind that money here as capital is a commodity, he said. So all the relations and evidence here would be irrational from the point of view of an ordinary commodity. Money is different. He said, if you want to call interest the price of money capital, then it's an irrational form quite at variance with the concept of price of commodities. So setting the price of money is a very different thing to the price of ordinary commodities. This is from theories, I think this is from Capital Volume 3. So saying, how can a product have a price which is not its value, its exchange value? And here's he said it. How can a sum of value have a price besides its own price? Price is the value of a commodity as distinct from its use value. A price which differs from its value in quality is an absurd contradiction. He said what it's sold is, in fact, you sell its use value, and its use value is to produce exchange value, to yield profit. So the reason you take on borrowed money is the expectation of a profit. And what you get is subjective elements now turning up, an uncertainty, an essential part of the price you're willing to pay for borrowed money. You only borrow money because of your expectations of profit. And I give a better example of that when I talk about capital assets, because it gives a very nice, clear example of how the cost of a capital asset cannot be its cost of production, or the price you'll pay for it can't be its cost of production. So he has this idea of a dialectic of money. Here we go again with the unity. So we're now trying to explain how do you make a profit, the MCM plus circuit. Here's money. He said the foreground is if you treat it as a commodity, it's essential to exchange, but the background, it's not a commodity. You can't produce it by means of other commodities. If you try to make money, you get sent to jail as a forger. Okay? Only banks create money in that legal sense. So that out of this dialectical tension, you get the argument that the price of money is set by its use value. But what is its use value? Well, it's subjective. It's not objective. The use value of money is your expectations of making a profit out of having borrowed it. So he said there's therefore no objective basis to the rate of interest. The rate of interest also reflects these subjective factors. So he said, competition does not determine the deviations for the price of money capital from its cost of production. He said there's no law of division except that coming out of competition between lenders. So he said there's no such thing as a natural rate of interest. And said whenever competition doesn't merely determine the deviations, the thing is lawless in some ways, that the price of money is an arbitrary and lawless factor. So rather than having a mechanical idea of the cost of money and money in terms of labour time, which is the conventional commodity interpretation of Marx, here he's got quite what would look like to Austrians an Austrian idea, except that he rejects the idea of a natural rate of interest. So he said interest is merely part of profit paid. So the maximum limit of interest, the most you'll pay, is what you expect to make in profit. That's the upper bound you're willing to pay. But the lower bound can be quite different. So the minimum level is indeterminable. Okay? Between paying nothing at all for borrowed money, up to the maximum of what you expect to get for profit, but then it's your subjective expectations that are setting that price, not anything you can calculate objectively. And the best example, I know this is confusing stuff when you first see it, so the best example comes when he discusses Ricardo, discussing the point of what price do you pay for minerals if you wanted to buy a mineral exploration lease. You wanted to buy the right to mine for minerals on somebody's land. What price do you pay? Well, he quotes Ricardo here and he says, Ricardo says that the compensation given for a mine or quarry is paid for the value of the coal or the stone which can be removed from them and has no connection with the original and indestructible powers of the land. So that's Ricardo's idea that the price you pay for a mine reflects the value of the coal. But he then says, no, this is Marx. There's a very significant connection between the original and destructible productions of the soil. The word value here is ugly. Okay? because he's saying, what is value in Ricardo's terms? Value is the labour value that's gone into making something. So you have an unexplored mind, no labour's gone into it. You can't get an exchange value valuation for minerals you haven't yet dug out of the ground. So Ricardo never uses the word value for utility. So when he says you pay, the compensation paid for the value, then what he means is you're paying for the labour that's gone into the mine when no labour has gone into the mine. So he said you're invalidating his entire doctrine of value. And this is where he clearly states his concept about how you value capital assets. What does value mean here, as it must do, the possible use value, and hence the prospective exchange value of the coal or stone. So the price you'll pay from mineral resources that haven't yet been exploited, the right to mine, to prospect for coal or iron or whatever else, will be what you think you can make for a profit of selling it, not the cost of making it in the first place, because it's free. It's sitting in the ground. Okay? So the value of capital assets is set by their use value. But their use value involves expectations and uncertainty, because you can't actually know what price you're going to get for it. It's possible use values. Marx says above there. He says prospective exchange values, what you think you can sell those resources for. So the idea that Keynes had about a gap between the supply price and the demand price, this is Marx. You can find a commonality between Keynes's concept of demand price and supply price and Marx's logic here. But rather than Keynes having to think up the idea himself out of the blue, which he really did between writing the general theory and publishing it in 1936 and writing his replies to Weiner in 1937, this is Marx deriving it from his underlying philosophy. And that's why I say this is so important, because one of the strengths of the neoclassical school is they have a unifying theory of value. Everything is taken back to marginal productivity, marginal utility, marginal cost, etc., etc. Utility maximisation, the optimisation framework, it's a coherent, even though it's wrong, it doesn't work, it's a coherent theory of value, and they can derive all their concepts from it, and they can share concepts with each other. Jung gave me a beautiful paper this morning that I'm using in my talk tomorrow. It's perfect for that comment, looking at the contrast, how neoclassicals try to handle the crisis. But they derive everything from that theory of value. Now, the non-neoclassical school doesn't have a unifying theory of value. I think this is it. I think this perspective, we can build the whole structure, and it gives us this common basis for deriving ideas, testing out the way they tie together, and so on. So you get three price levels turning up here. Out of the dialectic of the commodity, you get the existence of surplus, and you get commodities exchanging at their values, and you still explain where a profit comes from. So that's the first level that Marx manages to explain. There's a dialectic of labour. This explains his theory of the trade cycle that I talk about in tomorrow's lecture. That there's a minimum price for labour. Okay? Rather than saying the value of labour power is the wage, which is the usual labour theory of value thinking, according to Marx, the value of labour power is the minimum wage, but the wage will cycle between a minimum and a maximum. So there's a second price level driven by workers demanding a share of the surplus, or being beaten back by capitalists when they don't have much industrial power. And there's a dialectic of money and capital as well, with the exchange value of capital set by expectations of the use value of those things in the future. So you get a philosophical foundation for non-equilibrium economics coming out of Marx, without the labour theory of value, which is a load of baggage we should get rid of. But we can contrast to the equilibrium that's the core of the neoclassical vision. So I think having this background in his mind, having read Marx, not admitted to it, but having read Marx in great detail, this is a large part of Minsky's thinking. And a core here, again, like Schumpeter, is change. Schumpeter argues change is a necessary part of society. Marx has an organising framework for that in this concept of dialectics, foreground, background, and tension between the two. So I see it as a sound foundation for a non-equilibrium approach to economics. And that's the end of my lecture. That was a surprise, wasn't it? Thank you.